Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
Julia was setting the table for dinner and John and the children were playing in the living room. The doorbell rang. Julia went to open it. It was her mother-in-law, Betty. "Julia, hi. Finally got to you. Oh, it smells so good. Come on, show us your new family nest. Valentina Sergeyevna, it's so good that you're here in time for dinner. We barely had time to set up all the furniture and put things away. Come on, I'll show you around." Julia hung her mother-in-law's coat and bag in the hall closet, then took her by the elbow to show her their new apartment. After 8 years of living in rented apartments, John and Julia finally decided to buy an apartment and took out a mortgage. It wasn't an easy process, but they went about it with purpose. Now they are both determined to work hard to successfully close their debt. After they finished looking at the apartment, Julia and Betty settled down in the kitchen. "The children seem to like everything very much too," said Betty. "Yes, they love it. Eva has long wished she had her own room with a pink crib. And Mickey's big enough to have his own space. And I think we'll be able to pay off the loan without any problems. Both John and I have definite plans for work, and if things work out well, we can close the loan early." Julia was already taking the chicken and vegetables out of the oven. The aroma wafted throughout the apartment. The noise in the living room died down and neither John nor the children could be heard. It was strange that they had been quiet for so long. Julia quickly set the guest plates on the table and hurried to call the children and her husband to the table. But by this time they had already come running into the kitchen. "Mommy, Daddy promised us to arrange our rooms the way we want them to be. I want my room to be in game style. My favorite game is World of Tanks. I know exactly what it should be." "Daddy, you really said it was okay, didn't you?" Mickey still couldn't believe the will he'd been given. "Did Daddy deceive you?" said John. He sat down at the table and put his daughter Eva on his knee. "Ma, how you like our apartment?" John asked. "It's a wonderful apartment. And the sun, and enough heat. Most importantly, spacious. The children have their own nooks and crannies. It's good of you to take this step. Of course, if I could, I'd help you too." It's like Betty felt guilty. "Betty, what are you talking about? We're adults. We're not students. We're parents of children. Mickey, God, we both work. I think we can handle the loan payments on our own. It's normal for people to make it on their own. Well, some people get it ready-made. I've never envied that personally," Julia said. The family members were cooing among themselves that evening. They were overjoyed that they had finally moved into their own apartment. All the evening they dreamed about the renovations they would make when the rent was paid in full. Betty brought up the idea that right after the loan was closed, they should go somewhere together and have a vacation. Everyone liked that idea. Julia added that they would definitely take Betty on vacation. The children were doubly excited. It was a typical happy evening for John's family. Happiness, caring for each other, and lucid dreams were their way of life. John works in construction. Julia works for a private firm as a sales representative. Both grew up in simple families. They never had big ambitions, preferring to achieve everything by their honest labor. No one envied, but did not allow themselves to humiliate anyone. John's mother, Betty, raised him alone. She fell in love with Julia immediately. And since then, for 10 years of their life together, there has never been a conflict between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Neither of them had no idea what events awaited them in the near future. Maybe life is interesting because it has its own plans for people's destinies, while people are sure that they have everything under control. Julia felt like she was walking around in the fog all day at work today. She didn't sleep well last night. She had some kind of nightmarish, incomprehensible dream in which she is wandering in some dark forest and can't find her way out. After finishing her workday, she hurried home. She mentally imagined that now she would quickly prepare a delicious dinner, and by then John would be home in time to pick up the children from school. They would sit down together at the table, and all the hardships of the daily grind would be forgotten. At home, Julia quickly prepared a hot meal and 2 salads. The time was approaching 8:00 p.m., and her husband and children were still gone. Her cell phone rang. Julia saw an unfamiliar number and picked up the phone. Julia, hello. It's Eva's teacher calling. Classes ended a long time ago and you don't want to pick up your child from school. What? Did my husband pick up Eva? Julia asked. If your husband had, I wouldn't be sitting next to a crying Eva right now. I'd be home like everyone else, said the teacher. Wait a little longer, I'll be right there, Julia said and hung up. She dialed her husband's number as she put on her shoes in the hallway. There were long beeps and no one picked up. So if John hadn't gone to pick up Eva, Mickey was still at school. Julia hailed a cab and raced to Eva's school. Meanwhile, Mickey was sitting in the foyer of the school, looking out the window. When he saw his mom and sister, he was happy. Mommy, did you forget about us today? And Daddy didn't pick us up, said Mickey as if hurt. Julia left the school and dialed John's number again. There were still long beeps and no answer. On the way home, she called Betty, her husband's mother. It turned out she hadn't spoken to her son at all since the day she'd come to their housewarming party. Betty tried to reassure Julia. Maybe he got held up at work. Maybe he left his cell phone somewhere. Don't worry so much, take the kids and go home. John is not in the habit of disappearing without a good reason. I think he is already somewhere rushing to you, said the mother-in-law. Julia fed the children and sat down with them to do their homework. All this time she continued to call her husband from time to time. The children finished their homework and went to bed. Julia sat by the window in the kitchen until midnight and tried to chase bad thoughts out of her head. Despite the late hour, she decided to call John's closest friends. She looked up Barry's number in her phone book. They worked together. Surely he must know where John was. Barry said he hadn't been to work today and hadn't spoken to John either. Julia continued to wait for any word. When it was almost 2:00 a.m., Julia remembered John's other friend Billy. She looked up his phone number on his social media accounts and began frantically dialing on her phone. Billy's phone number turned out not to be working at all. Morning, but one thing is certain. It will take several more surgeries before he can live a full life. Julia and Betty now took turns sitting at the entrance to the intensive care unit, waiting for any news from John. The doctors were mysteriously evasive and kept saying the same thing. Wait. Betty prayed all the time, asking God to save the life of her only son. The children, when they learned what had happened to Daddy, refused to eat or go to school. Julia persuaded them with great difficulty and promised that very soon their daddy would be discharged home. Eva urged her to take her to the hospital and show her daddy. The word intensive care unit didn't mean anything to the children. Such agonizing days stretched for a week. Only on the 8th day the doctor said that John had opened his eyes and could be brought to a regular room. In the regular ward, John was half conscious. His whole body was bandaged. He was constantly being injected with pain medication and fed artificially. Julia and Betty had worked out a schedule of care between them. They stayed with him day and night. Julia tried to contact John's supervisor. He said briefly on the phone that he was aware of what was happening and would contact her again soon, but he never called back. This indifferent attitude of his employer offended John's relatives, but the most important thing for them now was the state of John's health. They decided to postpone the fight for the time being. After 3 weeks, he could already talk a little and tell them when he was thirsty or in pain. The doctor said that John could stay at home until the next surgery. In addition, the doctor said that the number of surgeries could be as many as 6 or 7. All of them are performed on the brain. After each surgery, appropriate care will be required. John was discharged home in a semi-living condition. He needed constant care and a loved one by his side. He was so thin that the children refused to believe he was their daddy. Julia was faced with a new challenge: how to take care of her seriously ill husband, manage to work, take the children to school, and not default on another loan. Betty drove to a business center in the bedroom district of the city. The Grand House sign was posted in every visible place. Even the button on the elevator pointed to the right floor. It had the Grand House Construction Company logo on it. Right at the entrance, a model-looking girl met her. "Hello, welcome to Grand House. Did you want to buy an apartment, make a payment, or any other matter?" "Hello, I'd like to meet the director. Could you tell me where his office is?" Betty said. "You have a seat. Can I bring you tea, coffee, cold drinks, or juice?" Smiled the girl. "Thank you, I don't need anything." "Then I will find out from the director if she can receive you," said the girl with model appearance and went to the other end of the office. A couple minutes later she came back and asked, "Excuse me, But what is your question to our director? I would like to talk about an employee of this company. He was recently injured at work, but no one from your company even came to see us, said Beatty. Okay, I'll tell him. The model girl went to the other end of the corridor again. After a couple of minutes, she came back and asked to wait for about 15 minutes because the director had an important meeting. Betty waited for almost 30 minutes, but it seemed that the meeting at the director's office did not end. She asked the girl to see if she could see the principal again. The girl came back a couple minutes later and said that the lunch break had started and the director would not be at work for at least an hour. Betty was upset, but decided to finish what she had started. She walked around the building for the remaining hour and later returned again. The principal kept putting off the appointment. It wasn't until near evening, tired and frustrated, that Betty was able to burst into the principal's office. For some reason, she had hoped to see a respectable middle-aged or elderly man. But in the office in the director's chair sat a young woman who looked less than 30 years old. Hello, my name is Betty. I'm the mother of your employee, John Walker. Almost a month ago, he fell from the roof of your company's building under construction and was seriously injured. In that time, neither you nor his supervisor have even bothered to come and see how things are going. Is that any way to treat your employees? Said Betty. Yes, Betty, we are very sorry that this happened. Unfortunately, workers don't always follow safety procedures and have accidents like this. How is your son doing now? The director asked. He survived by a miracle. He was in the intensive care unit for a week, then he was nursed in the hospital for 3 weeks. He will have to undergo at least 6 or 7 surgeries before he can live like a human being. And you say you're just sorry. Is that all you have to say? You're legally obliged to reimburse all medical expenses. Why don't you want to say anything about it? Betty said angrily. As a mother, I understand perfectly well. I've been worried about your son from the first day. Unfortunately, we can't pay compensation because your son was working part-time for us. What kind of part-time job? He's been working for you for 5 years. You can't deny it. Everyone in the construction team knows him. Maybe your son is well known to his colleagues, but it's all down to legalities. We pulled the paperwork and found that we have no employment contract with Walker John, which means any payment to you would be illegal. You're not gonna push us into breaking the law, are you? The director was being manipulative. What do you mean there's no paperwork? He's an official employee. If there are no documents, maybe your employees lost them. How inhumane of you to turn your back on your employee when he is in trouble. Betty continued to defend her position. Emma, a young and inexperienced company manager, did not like to get involved in other people's problems. She was always looking for easy ways, even if they were unfair. That's why this sharp conversation was weighing on her mind. She tried to brush off the annoying woman as quickly as possible. Besides, the workday was ending and it was time for her to go home to her daughter. In the end, instead of financial compensation, Betty got a lot of stress and frustration. On the way home, she repeatedly promised herself that she would deal with these unscrupulous people and get what she wanted. She headed to her son's house. At home, she caught Daria trying with great difficulty to bathe John and change his clothes. This normal everyday procedure cost the two women a great deal of effort. After they laid John down and gave him his medicine, Betty sat in the kitchen and cried. She told Julia about her trip to the company office. Until that day, Julia had hoped that company management would not be so inhumane about the tragedy of their loyal and valued employee. Barely concealing her resentment and pain, Julia tried to comfort her mother-in-law. The next 2 months were spent thinking about which problem to tackle first. After countless sleepless nights, Julia came to the conclusion that her first priority should be her husband's health. She needed to get him back on his feet at all costs. Even if he learned to take care of his own household needs, she could somehow carry the family on her own. In the meantime, the mother-in-law helps them. Occasionally, one of John's workmates and their wives offered to sit with him for a day or help Julia with household chores. At the same time, Julia managed to find the best doctors and run to them for appointments. As she studied John's medical records, each of them shook their heads and said that several complicated surgeries would indeed be required. Meanwhile, the family savings were running out. The next mortgage payment due date was approaching, but Julia wasn't giving up. Tonight, Julia picked up the kids from school, brought them home and fed the whole family. John is not yet able to sit down at the table. He is plagued by constant severe headaches. Many times Julia has noticed him moaning in pain and clenching his fists. But as soon as he sees his children, mother or wife in the room, he pretends that everything is fine. At night, the pains intensify and John flounders between heaven and earth. Now the family has a new ritual. Every night after dinner, the children gather around their father and they say warm words to each other. Julia reassures the family every night that these days will soon be over. Daddy will get well. He will make sure to renovate their rooms the way they want it. Then they will go on a trip together, and they would take Grandma Valia with them. After today's ritual, Julia instructed the children to do their homework on their own, dressed herself, and left the house. She came to the hotel, which is not far from her house. Julia was greeted by a friendly girl at the front desk. She asked to be shown to the manager's office. The girl took Julia to one of the administrative offices. The manager of the hotel was a stylishly dressed middle-aged man. "I beg you, give me at least some work here in your hotel. I don't live far away, and it won't be difficult for me to come to work on time and do overtime if necessary." Julia almost begged the manager. The manager listened to Julia's situation and was sympathetic. He hired her as a maid. She would have to work the night shift since she works at her day job. Julia agreed. She found the lack of sleep and fatigue more tolerable than the loss of her apartment and the lack of money for her husband's medical expenses. Once the second job was solved, Julia's business didn't end. She called her children and found out that they had finished their homework and were going to bed. She felt calmer in her heart. Now she could move on to her next plan. Julia walked around every block in her neighborhood. She had a stack of papers and a bottle of glue. She put up the ad she had written the other day and printed out. The next morning, every passerby could see the ad for take-home orders for a variety of made-to-order meals, including pastries. Julia had a knack for cooking. Why not take advantage of that talent? At first, it was difficult for Julia to get used to the new rhythm of life, but it turned out that everything can be adapted to. The children entered into the position of mom and took responsibility for their lessons on themselves. They also learned to help their father take his medicine and do simple physical exercises. Beatty walked briskly ahead, Julia following behind her. Entering the office of the construction company, Betty did not make nights with the model girl. She went straight to the director's office. Emma found herself in the office. As you might expect, she tried to shoo the two women out the door and keep them waiting for an unknown amount of time. But this time, Betty wasn't falling for such tricks. When Emma realized that she was having trouble keeping up with the pressure of the two women, she directed them to her lawyer's office. It turned out to be a young guy. When Julia and her mother-in-law entered his office, he was sitting in his chair talking on the phone. The guy quickly ended the conversation and made himself comfortable at his desk. He made a gesture with his hand to sit down. When Betty told the purpose of her visit, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and made a displeased face. Julia had already anticipated the course of the conversation. "Excuse me, what's your name?" Julia asked. "Tony, or just Tony for you?" "Tony, please tell me, how come my husband has been working for you for 5 years, and you say that you have no obligations to him?" Julia asked. "You see, Julia, not all people are used to legal precision. Yes, we recognize that your husband has been with us for a long time, but an employment relationship must be accompanied by binding legal documents. In this case, it's a contract of employment, which is signed for a year and renewed every year. We found out that your husband has not renewed his contract with us for several years. Accordingly, he is a nobody in this company within the law. What do you suggest if the law forbids any payment to strangers who are not listed in the company's records?" Tony's lawyer spread his hands. "And how can we be sure that you didn't deliberately destroy documents to avoid paying compensation?" Julie asked forehead to forehead. "Did you realize what you're accusing us of right now?" Tony was indignant. "I know for a fact, and my husband can confirm it himself, that he worked for your company officially. You withheld taxes from his wages. True, it will be a problem for us to prove it because you have all these documents in your possession. But what about simple human fairness? If your facility had all the technical security measures in place, my husband could have avoided this tragedy. Who will be held responsible? Why should we have to suffer the consequences of such negligence alone?" Betty was starting to lose her temper again. "You're asking all the right questions. The answer requires a full investigation and an objective view. Only the judiciary can do that. So if you want to get justice, let's continue this conversation through the court," said Tony. Betty was surprised. She and Julia had considered going to court as a last resort. They had planned to threaten the director with a lawsuit if other attempts failed. And here, the company lawyer himself was the first to suggest going to court. When the two women realized that talking to the lawyer was even more hopeless than talking to the director, they silently left their office. They went straight to the city courthouse. There they were politely asked to write an application and wait for the registration of the application. This process took almost half a day. The young investigator invited the tired and exhausted women to his office. We contacted the management of the Grand House Company and found out that the victim was not an official employee of the company. Therefore, the company does not bear any legal responsibility in this case. In this case, there is no reason to file a case against the company. You will not be able to prove the company's guilt in court anyway. You will just lose time and nerves. I think it's unnecessary in your case, said the investigator. Julia and Betty have no doubt that Emma has long arms and will not get justice. But Betty wasn't out of arguments yet either. She and Julia had left the courthouse and were now headed for the offices of the city's TV station. The reporters were genuinely sympathetic and promised to help them. It didn't take them long, and they promised to come to John's house the next day and do a report. The video was ready by the next evening. It was shown on a city TV channel and was scrolling on social media. The Grand House Company, its director Emma, was cursed and disgruntled by a huge number of people. After seeing the video and people's reactions, Emma became furious. Julia and Betty still hoped for justice and naively waited for a call from the company's management, but they clearly underestimated Emma's capabilities. Julia finished her maid's shift at the hotel in the late morning and hurried home. She needed to get a couple hours of sleep before getting the kids ready for school and helping her husband with his morning routine. At home, she found that John had been up all night again and was in pain. He almost fell out of bed, but as soon as Julia came in, he pulled himself together and pretended to be a man who had just woken up. Eva and Mickey learned to pack and get to school on their own. Mickey, as the eldest, has taken responsibility for his sister. He usually walks her all the way to class, waits for her after class, and they walk home together. When the children left for school, Julia and John were left alone. Julia had another hour of time before she had to go to her main job. She decided to spend this time with her husband. John finds it very difficult to talk, so sometimes he writes on paper or tries to gesture his thoughts. Today, he wrote on paper that he was exhausting his family and himself. He asked Julia not to get too worked up about his continued treatment. If it's meant to get better, it's going to happen either way. If it's not fated, then I don't want you and Mom to waste your energy. Remember, honey, our kids need you besides me. That's what John wrote on the paper. Julia read the note aloud, put the paper aside, and lay down on her husband's chest. Love for one's family and loved ones awakens a woman's great strength, her natural power. I can feel it in me now. From the outside, it may seem that I am exhausted, but it is only on a physical level. As soon as I think about our goals and dreams, all the difficulties are forgotten. I'm sure we can endure anything. So I won't give up. And you don't give up, I beg you, Julia said. John stroked her shoulder in agreement with her. At that moment, someone rang the doorbell. I'll go open the door. It must be the courier who brought the medicine I ordered yesterday. Julia hurried to the front door. A moment later, she saw a brightly colored girl of tall stature standing in front of her. She smelled of expensive perfume, and her fiery red lipstick went well with her blonde hair. Hello, Julia. I apologize 1,000 times. I shouldn't have come to your house, but I can't go on like this. Uncertainty kills a man. The girl spoke in riddles. Excuse me, who are you? What can I do for you? Julie asked in surprise. The girl pretended to be an extremely agitated person. She was flitting from side to side on the spot and constantly twiddling her thumbs. You don't know me. My name is Angelina. I need to see John and talk to him. Seeing isn't a problem, but can I ask about the topic of conversation? The thing is, John can't be disturbed right now, said Julia. Yes, I've heard he's in a tough spot. I've been living with it as long as you have. That's why I couldn't bear to visit him today. The girl looked at the floor and continued to pretend that she couldn't express the main thought. Maybe, Angelina, you can tell me the purpose of your visit and I'll tell John. If he finds it in his power to meet you, I will escort you to his room, said Julia. This may be difficult for you as a woman, Julia. I suggested that John tell you about it a long time ago, but he was adamantly against it. He felt sorry for you and said that he loved the children very much and would not let them suffer. Julia still couldn't understand the context of the conversation. The girl started from afar and continued to operate with riddles. Involuntarily, Julia began to experience disturbing emotions. When we met, John did not immediately say that he had a family, and I naively fell in love with him. You understand me as a woman, don't you? I suppose you love him too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have cared for him so devotedly, said the girl. The day John had his accident, I found out I was pregnant. I think John, as the father of the child, has a right to know. And perhaps it will give him new strength, and he will get well sooner, said the girl and looked questioningly at Julia. Julia closed the door silently and crouched on the threshold. She sat for quite a while, going over in her mind every day of her married life. She had never before observed John's penchant for infidelity. She could not understand how he was able to spend time with another woman when he gave all his energies to work and care for his family. But after all, the girl had spoken very convincingly. Before Julia closed the door, she was even going to show the result of the ultrasound to confirm the pregnancy. Just the thought of Julia living with the illusion of a strong family gave her unbearable heartache. So all her hard work and agony could be for nothing. Yeah, a new baby could really inspire John to get better, and then he just might go to this beautiful girl. And after all, no one can give a guarantee on fate's future plans. Julia realized that she definitely wouldn't have the energy for her work today. She called her supervisor and lied that her husband became ill during the night and had to take him to the hospital. She promised to report to work tomorrow. She herself, on woozy legs, headed to John's room, which had long since resembled a medical treatment room. John quickly gathered all his strength into a fist and painted a mask of calmness on his face, although he was tormented by severe pain in his head and in the bones throughout his body. Angelina came by, asking him to tell her that she was pregnant. She hopes the new baby might inspire you to heal faster. If that's the case, try to get back on your feet as soon as possible, Julia said, looking out the window into the distance. I don't know any Angelina. Who's the kid? What are you talking about? John struggled to get the words out. Every sound echoed in his head and aggravated his headache. Julia's pain was no less severe. Suddenly, she felt that she did not want to spend another minute in this room. She left the house and headed towards the nearest park. For the next few hours, she wandered aimlessly through the park. She tried to find some rational thoughts inside her, but her whole inner world was filled with heavy emotions. In addition, she was physically exhausted. At that moment, she received a phone call from Betty. Julia couldn't find the strength to answer her call and dropped it. Toward evening, Julia realized that she had to make an effort to determine her future direction in life. She realized that she didn't want to go on like this. Even in the morning, she had felt that she was able to roll mountains, but now she didn't understand why she needed to. She called the children and reminded them to come home on time, eat, and do their homework. She didn't want to think about John now. She spent the night working at the hotel, and after her shift was over, she decided to sleep in one of the rooms and drive directly to her main job from there. At her main job, she went to her supervisor that same day and asked for permission to take a short vacation. After getting the supervisor's approval, she called Beatty and asked to stay with them for a few days. Julia lied that she was being sent on a well-paid business trip and packed her bags and bought a ticket to her parents' house. Julia's parents were aware of their daughter's family tragedy. Julia only briefly said that she was very tired and came to them to rest for a few days. Her mother hovered around her. Her father tried to distract her with talk, but all this had no effect. Julia's mind was constantly spinning with the question of what to do next. Being a prisoner of unbearable mental suffering, Julia did not notice how 5 days flew by. She talked to her children periodically and was calm for them. The last few months had been hard on them as well. They had forced the children to grow up dramatically. Beatty herself called Julia every day and told her about John's condition. Julia only listened to her stories idly. Shoma's gotten worse without you. He stopped eating, constantly tries to tell me something about you. Apparently, he missed you very much. But I know it's important for you to hold on to your job. We'll manage somehow, you just take care of yourself. That's how her mother-in-law ended her conversation every day. Back home, Julia decided to take ground transportation. In fact, she was in no hurry to get home. She wanted to spend as much time alone with herself as possible and come to some decision, but it was all in vain. The long-distance bus stopped periodically and people got off to stretch their legs. At one of these stops, Julia saw an unanswered call on her phone. Although she didn't feel like talking to anyone right now, she made an exception for Leslie. Leslie is the wife of Billy, John's closest friend. Millie and John have been working together since the beginning of this company. Julia had seen Leslie several times during that time, and each time she had left only positive impressions. Julia honestly said that she decided to gain strength and be with her parents, and told her family that she was going on a business trip. Leslie, for some reason, did not want to believe and continued to ask additional questions. So, how's the relationship? Are you and John all right? The usual Leslie, so to speak, courageously withstand all the trials of fate. Julia was hiding a hot topic. You know what? I don't think so. We're not gonna talk about this over the phone. You please, when you arrive, call me at once. You and I need to see and talk urgently, said Leslie, and ended the conversation. Julia didn't really want to meet Leslie. She realized that right now any meeting and any conversation would carry an unnecessary emotional burden that she could not bear. But as soon as Julia arrived home, Leslie called and said she was waiting at the nearest coffee shop. Upon seeing Julia, John visibly perked up. During her absence, he had written her several pages of letters. Julia glanced at them and realized that they contained typical male excuses. She didn't want to read the rest of it, put it on the windowsill, and left to meet Leslie. So tell me, darling, what's up? How are things going? Leslie looked at Julia with a scrutinizing gaze. Julia tried to wave away with general phrases, but Leslie had to start the important conversation herself. Do you know anything about Angelina? How do you know? Wait, everyone knew but me and didn't say anything about it. Julia was getting worse. You can't say they knew and didn't say anything. I just found out the other day. But Billy had known for a long time. Did she come to your house? Leslie asked. Yes, she did, asking me to show John. Asked me to understand. It was difficult for Julia to recount the emotional conversation she'd had with Angelina. What about you? Leslie asked. What about me? I had a breakdown inside. I needed some time to myself, so I took a short vacation and went to my parents' house. But that didn't make it any easier. Julia sighed heavily. So what's next? What are you going to do next? Leslie looked at Julia with curiosity. If I knew the answers to that question, Julia had tears in her eyes. And Leslie smiled, took Daria's hands and said, You do love your John, don't you? I see, you have everything very serious. Leslie almost laughed out loud. Only Julia could not understand what was so funny. Your John wasn't cheating on you. How could you fool, believe that? This Angelina, by the way, works at Grand House. She's here on behalf of her director. Billy, when he was filing reports in the office last week, he overheard some chatter in the kitchen. Somebody in the company told Emma to do something that'll get you two apart, and someone else suggested the idea of Angelina and her pregnancy. What woman could handle that? It was their devious plan. Julia couldn't believe her ears. Really, how could she believe it? Really, she hadn't expected Emma to go to such low acts. Why would she? So what if we fight amongst ourselves? Julia asked Leslie. Well, it's elementary. You'll fight among yourselves, and you won't have time to fight with the company. Now it is clear that John is held by your forces. If you're out, no one can help him. That's what they had in mind. Julia left her coffee unfinished, hurriedly said goodbye to Leslie and ran home. At home, Betty sat beside the suffering John. Julia crouched down next to John, slowly touched her face to his and apologized to John. John made an effort on himself and nodded his head feebly, expressing a sign of agreement with her. This is when Julia's emotions broke through her, and she began to sob at the top of her voice. Betty quickly took her into the kitchen, sat her down at the table, and began to soothe her. Julia told her mother-in-law everything. She was horrified and told her story. It turned out that since the day the video report was shown on television, Betty had received several phone calls from unknown people making threats. She decided not to alarm Julia and didn't tell her about it. In her absence, Betty had to involve her colleagues and friends in her worries. Some she asked to accompany the children to school, others to take them back. In the end, it turned out that the last few days had been a living hell for Betty. Betty, my parents are also very concerned about our situation. My mom suggested that if it was convenient for us, we could send the kids to them for a while. And now I realize it's just a necessity. We don't know how much more of this Emma will retaliate against us, but she probably won't stop there. In the evening, Julia and Betty talked to the kids and explained that they would have to stay in a foreign town with their grandparents for a couple or 3 months. The children, of course, refused. They didn't want to leave their father in that condition. Neither Mickey nor Eva had ever been away from their mother for long before. They cried and begged not to be sent away. Betty had to make an effort to convince her grandchildren. Grandma and Grandpa love you very much. They will be glad to have you visit them, and you will meet new kids there. See how they study in other cities. And your mom and I will take care of your dad's health. God willing, by the time you get back, your daddy will be back on his feet. The next morning, Betty arranged with a good friend of hers and paid to have the children delivered directly to the grandparents' house. There was a long line at the entrance to the department head's office. Periodically, a girl would come out of the office and call out names. After a few minutes, people came out of that office with satisfied faces and headed for the cash register. Julia's queue didn't take long. She entered the office and closed the door behind her. Hello? Hello, Julia Walker? Your passport? Julia placed her passport on the desk. The men in expensive jackets sitting at the desk thumbed through the papers, compared the passport to the stack of documents, and slid it to the gift. Sign at the end of each document. You are left with 1 copy each. With them, you will now go to the cashier's office and receipt the money. Julia was overjoyed. She had long hesitated before taking a loan for John's operations, but she realized that she had no other choice. She also realized that she was solely responsible for the loan. After signing the documents, she hurried to the cash register. At the cashier's office, the money was quickly disbursed. In a few minutes, Julia was already putting the wrapped bundles of brand new bills into her bag. She clutched the bag in her armpit and rushed straight to the clinic. There was a new line waiting for her at the doctor's office. As soon as she entered his office, she began to put out wads of money one by one. Doctor, you and I met last week. You said my husband could be fixed. We agreed to any number of surgeries, but please help us. What did you have again? The doctor was squinting at her. And you'll pay the money at the cash register. Julia felt a little embarrassed by her own fuss. She pulled out John's thick medical card and placed it on the doctor's desk. The doctor thumbed the card one more time and said, "That's it, I remember. I'll put your husband on the surgery schedule today. You will bring him in tomorrow morning and we will begin preparations for the surgery." As Julia walked home, she was pleased that she had had a very good day. After a series of conversations with the director of the company, she had gotten the impression that no one cared about her sick husband and her family tragedy. But she was able to apply for loans relatively quickly. And the doctor was a good one. Without unnecessary conversations, proceeds to the main task. On the way, she called her mother-in-law and told her everything. The next day, John was brought to the hospital by ambulance. His condition had deteriorated markedly in the last few days, and he was having difficulty walking on his own feet. As soon as he got to his feet, the headache worsened and was joined by persistent dizziness. John had suffered a very serious head injury in a fall from a height. Surgery was scheduled for the next day. Restoring the work of such a complex mechanism as the human brain is not an easy job. In almost 8.5 hours of surgery, several doctors did jewelry work on the brain. Now we can hope that John will be more independent, at least in terms of self-care. And most importantly, he can sleep at night instead of suffering from horrible continuous pain. After the surgery, John was left in the ICU for a few more days. During these days, Julia tried to do as much as she could at all of her jobs to carve out the funds to pay off 2 large loans. After John was moved to a regular room, Betty was by his side at all times. Indeed, within a few days, John was on the mend. He could now walk down the corridor in the hospital several times a day. His speech has become much clearer. Speaking is no longer so difficult for him. His movements are much clearer. He can now confidently hold a spoon and eat on his own. Betty and Julia's gratitude to the doctors was unmatched. After a couple of weeks of rehabilitation at the next checkup, the doctor said that John could be discharged home. The next surgery could be scheduled in 2 months at the earliest. The doctor promised that John could strengthen and gain strength during this time. In the daily hustle and bustle, 2 months flew by quickly, and John returned to the clinic again. The second surgery lasted almost 5 hours. After the surgery, the doctor reported that there are significant improvements in brain function. Perhaps it will be possible to cure John completely, not in 6, but in 3-4 operations. This time, Julia did not have the energy to visit the hospital. Her mother-in-law took full charge of the family again. She was helped by her friend and colleagues. and Julia was able to sleep occasionally between her 2 jobs and her part-time job. In the course of treatment, unexpected expenses proved to be many. The substantial loan taken out for the surgery melted away like snow on a sunny day. Every time she counted the rest of the money, Julia promised herself that she would work harder and harder. The day of the next installment of the loan was approaching. Julia was horrified by the rapidity of the schedule. She barely had enough money to close one loan before the second one was due. On one such day, she fell off schedule and both loans began to accrue late interest. Julia called each of the banks and asked them to renegotiate the terms. But even after that, the accumulated debt remained decent. A few weeks passed and now the bank officials started calling her every day. Julia carried all her earnings to the bank. She and John have been living off Betty for a long time. She buys them food at her own expense and pays their bills. Julia feels bad about that. Betty herself is already a senior citizen with a whole bunch of chronic diseases. Despite this, she spares no effort, money or time to support her son's family. In a fit of anger, Julia decided to go to the Grand House Construction Company once again. This time she met with David, the company's financial director. Unfortunately, David Markovic turned out to be just as cynical as the director Emma and the lawyer Tony. In addition to saying many unpleasant words, David Markovic threatened that if the company wanted to, he could sue the family for defamation. He added that Emma's very big connections would leave Walker no chance to prove anything. Julia felt like a squeezed lemon again after this conversation. She came home and said to her mother-in-law, "Betty, you haven't had a rest in months. I can see how tired you are. I'll try to stay home for the next couple of days. You'll get some rest, regain your strength, and we'll continue our fight again. Mickey God, John's doing much better. He can take care of himself." Betty really needed to rest, so she didn't argue with her sister-in-law and went to her house. Julia was sure that 2-3 days would pass and her mother-in-law would come to the rescue again with renewed vigor. But 2 days later, her friend called and told her that Betty had been hospitalized with severe poisoning. Before she could hang up the phone and gather her thoughts, there was a knock at the door. Julia opened the door and saw 2 policemen standing in front of her. "Julia Walker?" one of them asked. "Yes, what's wrong?" Julia was at a loss. "You're coming with us to the station," said the other policeman, pulling Julia by the arm. "Why? What's wrong? What do you want from me?" Julia panicked, but the policeman wasn't about to let her go. She asked for 2 minutes to change her clothes and take her cell phone with her, but she wasn't allowed to do either. The policeman dragged Julia outside right in her house slippers. John took his medication and was asleep at the time. He never realized where Julia had gone. The policeman drove in silence. Julia thought that one of the banks had probably turned the case over to the police for defaulting on a loan. She tried several more times to find out why they were taking her to the police station and what they would talk about, but it was all in vain. At the police station, Julia was left for several hours waiting to be questioned by an investigator. She was simply handcuffed to the batteries as if she were a terrible criminal. When she tried to make a fuss, it was made clear to her that there would be bad consequences. After 3 or 4 hours, the investigator took her into his office and finally told her what this was all about. "Walker Julia, huh? We're going to get to the bottom of this. Aha! You are a suspect in the poisoning of your mother-in-law, Walker Betty." The investigator looked at her with a menacing look and shook his head. "A woman with severe poisoning was admitted to the toxicology ward early this morning. We have information that you make homemade cakes, and the day before it was you who delivered the cake to your mother-in-law," dumbfounded the investigator Julia. She was speechless. She only repeated that she had not handed over any cake and certainly had no reason to poison her mother-in-law. But the investigator refused to believe it. Mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law have long been in quiet confrontation with each other. Why not? Why not take the opportunity to plant poison if the mother-in-law somehow pissed off the daughter-in-law? That's what the investigator thought. In the end, Julia failed to convince the investigator that she was not involved in the poisoning. He decided to send Julia to a temporary detention center for suspects for 3 days. It was with great difficulty that she managed to get permission from the investigator to make one phone call. Julia called John and told him what had happened. She added that she had not handed any cake to Betty. John felt sick at first. He gathered all his strength into a fist out of habit. Even if he fainted now, there was no one to help him. and what had happened to Julia didn't fit into any logic at all. John didn't think long and called his friend Billy. He asked Billy to help him visit his mother. He was going to find out the details of what had happened. Fortunately, by then, Betty had recovered and was feeling better. John and Billy listened to the details. It turned out that the night before, someone had knocked on Betty's door. She opened the door and saw a young man standing in front of her. He'd introduced himself as a courier and said that his sister-in-law Julia had given her a small gift. Betty was very surprised because Julia knew very well that her mother-in-law strictly limits herself in sweets. Julia even supported her in every possible way. Even occasionally, when her mother-in-law was tempted to eat something sweet, Julia reminded her of her diabetes and always recommended eating fruit. That day, for some reason, Betty decided to eat a small piece of cake. It looked so appetizing. She ate a small piece, drank some tea, and went to bed. Close to midnight, she felt sick. She felt nauseous and vomited continuously. John and Billy immediately sensed the gross inconsistencies in the situation. If Julia had really been delivering the cake to her mother-in-law, she would have informed John about it. Billy immediately figured out what was going on and took an interest in the guy who had handed over the cake. He whispered in John's ear, "This could be a story just like the one with Angelina. I told you there was no way Emma and her subordinates could calm down." Now they knew what direction they should take. Betty was the only one who didn't recall any distinctive features of the cake courier. Billy and John left the hospital and talked outside for a while. They realized that they had to act quickly and clearly to save Julia. They arrived at Betty's house to see the surveillance tape in the entryway. The videotape put everything into perspective. Billy's assumptions were confirmed. He recognized the cake delivery man. The delivery man was pretending to be one of Emma's employees again. This new guy named Anthony is really a delivery guy. Only he doesn't deliver cakes, but he does deliveries for the Grand House Construction Company. Billy remembers the story with Angelina very well. Apparently, Emma has decided to go all the way in her place and now decided to quarrel Betty with Julia. All the more reason to do so. Last week, Julia went to the company and spoke to David, the CFO. Billy and John gave the tape to the investigator and explained the circumstances of the case. The investigator instructed them to find the courier for the Grand House Company and bring him to the station. The guy was brought in a few hours later. At the confrontation, the guy continued to claim that Julia had given him the cake. But when the investigator started to find out when, where, and how Julia offered him this venture, the guy started to blend in his testimony. The investigator found a lot of inconsistencies. Anthony could not explain how Julia contacted him and how they knew each other. After a while, Anthony got tired of repeating his learned version and started to give up. Indeed, it had been Emma's idea. Only it wasn't she who had given Anthony such an assignment, it was Tony's lawyer who had done it. He promised that Anthony would get away with it. Even if the police got wind of it, Tony assured him he'd get him out of there easily. Additionally, the guy was incentivized with a bonus immediately in hand. The young and naive student fell for it. The further fate of Anthony, John, and Billy was of no interest. The main thing was that the investigator let Julia go home, but she experienced a huge shock and stress while she was in the detention center. In the evening, she visited her mother-in-law and cried in her arms. It seems that they will not be able to prevail against these dishonest people. They agreed that their most important victory was that John was safe and put back on his feet. Julia resolved never to go into that company again. God himself is their judge, added her mother-in-law, and reassured her daughter-in-law. The shock had shaken Julia and knocked her out of her usual rhythm of life. Over the next few days, she lost her appetite, slept poorly, and could not pull herself together. In addition, she was harassed by regular calls from bank employees. She realized that she would not be able to make the payments this month either. Julia was already physically unable to keep up with her 2 jobs and her part-time home job making cakes to order, especially as the time for John's neck surgery was approaching. She was worried about him. On top of that, Julia missed her children very much. They called every night and gushed about their new life. It wasn't easy for them either, but the grandparents tried their best to distract them. Julia promised the children every day that she would take them back to her. The next morning, the clinic called and reminded that it was time for John to go to bed to prepare for surgery. By that time, Betty had fully recovered from the poisoning and was resting at home. John packed his bags and went to the clinic again. This time the surgery went much easier. The doctor said that the rehabilitation would be much shorter this time too. John was going to be discharged in 10 days. That night, Julia stayed at the clinic next to John. She returned home early in the morning to change and get ready for work. At the hotel, she had arranged with her shift girl, and she was filling in for her. Julia stepped off the elevator and saw strangers at her apartment door. They were knocking on her door. "Are you here to see us?" Julia asked and immediately realized that she had rushed her question. She felt another trouble. She blamed herself for not turning around and leaving, for not pretending she didn't live here. These people turned out to be bailiffs. One of the banks had already taken the case to court for delinquency. The judge had ruled in favor of the bank, and now these people were coming to take all the valuable property. Julia couldn't do anything. She was forced to open the door. As soon as the door opened, strangers broke into the apartment and began to take out all the property, from the TV to her jewelry. Maybe these possessions could cover some of the debt. Julia didn't care much about that question now. It would only be a little while before John would be able to work. Then things would get better, and they would have property again. Julia told her mother-in-law all about it. She did not stay away and shared her furniture and everything else she needed. The relatives didn't stay away either. Someone brought their unwanted TV set, someone donated kitchen furniture. But Julia was most concerned about the mortgage arrears. The bank reminded her every day that soon they would take the case to court, and the apartment would be taken off the market. Julia begged for a little time, and she would get everything under control, pay off the interest, and the payments would be back on schedule. Betty tried her best to hold on, but periodically she, too, could not handle the stress. At such times she went to church, prayed and asked God for strength to endure all these trials. And of course she asked God several times each time for help for her son. When she heard the news about the confiscation of her property, she was again very upset. To regain her strength, the next morning she went to church. This time she did not want to leave the church. After praying, she sat in the church talking to the congregation for a long time. She told them her story, and each of them encouraged her and promised to pray for her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. She headed home as she felt a bright sense of lightness and a ray of hope in her soul. On the way back, she decided to walk home, even though the distance was decent. She didn't feel like jostling for public transportation at all. She was feeling fine today and could afford to take a walk in the fresh air. She walked along the sidewalk and dreamed that soon she would be able to hug her grandchildren and take them to the park as before. The time was getting closer to evening. The hustle and bustle of the city was picking up, and the streets were filled with the cars of citizens returning home from work. Betty walked past a busy intersection. Long traffic jams always formed at this place in the evening. This evening was no exception. The drivers behind the wheel lazily pulled up and peered at the traffic lights. Betty's attention was drawn to the incessant honking of one of the cars in the traffic jam. How illogical it is to stand in the middle of traffic and honk at others. It's not a good life for the other motorists in this jam, she thought. Surely the whole crowd was outraged by this behavior of the unknown driver. After a while, an elderly man ran out of the car and started shouting something to the people around him, but his shouts disappeared in the street noise. The man returned to his car, honked his horn, shouted something again, and continued to fuss. None of the drivers paid any attention to him. Following him, a woman ran out of the back seat of the car. She too started shouting something and waving her hands. Such strange behavior of elderly people caused many questions among passers-by, but no one asked what happened to them. The traffic lights changed in the usual way, but the street congestion did not diminish. On the contrary, the traffic jam only lengthened, with more and more cars at the intersection. After a while, it seems, the man and the woman got tired of fussing. Somewhere in the distance, the sounds of an ambulance siren can be heard. However, the ambulance has no chance of breaking through this jam. In unison with the siren, a man and a woman kept shouting something around their car. Betty was genuinely curious as to what was making these people so frantic. She moved away from the sidewalk and sat down on a bench along the road. At the same time, she decided to observe why these strange people were behaving so atypically. But immediately, they quieted down a bit and were no longer audible. She took out her cell phone and decided to call her grandchildren. Her sister-in-law, Irina Alexandrovna, picked up the phone. They talked for a while. She told her that the children missed their parents very much. Irina Alexandrovna made it clear that they were also distressed to see their grandchildren suffering in unusual conditions. Then Eva came to the phone. Beatty sensed some resentment in her voice. "Grandma, you said everyone here loves us, but there's a girl named Lisa at school who is always hurting me. She says that we were brought here because my father is crippled and can't take care of us. Tell me, is that not true? Is Daddy getting better?" "You're my good girl. Do not pay attention to evil tongues. Lisa does not know what she's talking about. You should not listen to her words. I just visited your dad and mom yesterday. Your dad's home from surgery. He'll be able to walk on his own now. He needs less and less medicine and shots. Soon he'll be able to work again. He'll be sure to make your rooms just the way you wanted them. Then you'll all go on a trip. That's what you should be thinking about. So how are you getting on with your studies?" Betty was trying to distract her granddaughter. "I'm doing very well in my studies. It turns out they don't assign a lot of homework here. I'm getting through all my classes with ease. I have a lot of free time, so I borrow books from the library, read them and tell the teachers. They all praise me." Eva's really switched on. "So how's Mickey? Does he like it among his new friends? Does he get hurt?" Betty asked. "No, he's not afraid of anyone. Also, he's made it clear to everyone that no one dares to hurt me. That's why the boys don't pull my hair. They behave quietly and calmly in front of me. Can you imagine, Grandma?" Eva became animated and even started laughing. At that moment, Betty noticed that the strange man and the strange woman had lost control of themselves and were almost hysterical. She said goodbye to her granddaughter and put her phone in her bag. The next moment, she saw an elderly man carrying a 6-7-year-old girl in his arms and shouting something. Beatty got up from her seat and headed in their direction. But by this time, the man had already left the car rows and was running down the sidewalk. Following him was a woman running. As they got close, BT noticed that the girl was showing no signs of life. Both her arms and legs were dangling in the man's hands, her face blue. Put the child on the bench. BT herself was surprised at her own initiative. The man saw the bench, but the girl wanted and pleaded. "For God's sake, help. Do something, she's getting away." Although Betty was far from medicine, she had learned a lot during her son's illness. She felt the girl's pulse and realized that time was running out, if not running out. She opened the girl's eyes and looked at the pupils. The situation was indeed serious. BT dropped the bag and started giving the girl indirect cardiac massage. What happened to her? She had time to ask a question to the woman who had already arrived. "My little girl was perfectly healthy. She was playing in the car and threw candy in her mouth. I think she choked on it. We've been trying to help her breathe for almost half an hour now, but all attempts have failed. The ambulance can't get here because of the traffic jam," said the woman, wiping away her tears. Then BT turned the girl on her stomach and began to massage between her shoulder blades. She asked the man to bend the girl's head down and hold it in that position. Then Beatty covered the girl's mouth with one hand and pressed hard on her stomach with the other hand. A wheeze appeared. She now realized she was acting correctly. She let the girl rest for a few seconds and repeated her manipulation again. After a few precise movements, the wheezing became louder. Eventually, the unfortunate lollipop fell to the ground. The girl continued to sob. Apparently, her lungs had become severely strained. A few minutes of stopping breathing did not go in vain for the child's body. She laid the girl on her back and continued to massage on her heart. Her pulse began to return. The blueness in her face was gradually disappearing. The sobs became longer and louder. The girl began to move her toes. At that moment, the congestion at the intersection significantly decreased, and the ambulance was getting closer and closer. An elderly man ran towards the ambulance. He was explaining something to them, waving his arms, but the distance was still considerable. In the end, the rescuers in white coats left the car and ran to the bench. Now the girl urgently needs to help restore the work of vital organs. This can already be handled only by a doctor. BB handed the girl into their hands. They carried the girl to the ambulance. An elderly man and a woman followed them. But after a few steps, the man turned back and thanked Beatty. "How can we find you later?" he asked. "I live near here, but in fact I spend all the time at my son's house. It's in another neighborhood. Give us your phone number, we owe you forever. We should definitely meet up later," said the man. BT dictated her phone number. She watched the man and woman running and said to herself, "God bless this innocent girl, and may no mother suffer for the child's sake." Then she followed the usual route to her son's house. She had not been here for several days, and she missed her son and daughter-in-law. John was home alone. He was doing physical exercises for his recovery. Julia was still at work. Betty looked around the apartment. Of the possessions, there was nothing left in the apartment. Empty walls and furniture donated by acquaintances. The bailiffs had confiscated all the appliances from the kitchen. If Julia used to enjoy cooking and even earn money from it, now she has no such opportunity. And so it would be at least an outlet for a woman. When a person is very difficult, it seems to him that time has stopped. But light shows that hard days usually pass much faster than they seem. For the Walker family, those days seemed like an eternity. But already 2 seasons had changed, bright and dark events were happening in parallel, holidays were celebrated. New people appeared around the family, and some of their old friends disappeared from their lives forever. John was slowly but purposefully working on his health and regaining his strength. Julia is still running to her 2 jobs and counting the days until they can finally take the kids home. Betty spends all her free time around her son. She has forgotten about the time she rescued a little girl on the street. She was reminded of it today by a phone call. An unfamiliar voice in the receiver said, "Hello, Betty. Maybe you have already forgotten about us. We have not even had time to get acquainted with you. A couple of weeks ago, our granddaughter almost had an emergency and you helped us then." "Oh, yes. I remember everything. How's the girl?" Betty asked. "She's fine now. Although if it hadn't been for you, there's no telling what would have happened." The man sounded agitated. "But it's all in the past, and I'm calling you for an important reason. My wife from the first days wants to meet you, get to know you better, and sit in a small circle. I agree with her. So if it's convenient for you, we're expecting you at our home this Saturday. Be our guest of honor. We will be very happy," said the man. "Well, since you are already well, then we can sit down," Betty replied. On the appointed day, a car with a driver was waiting for her in the yard. She got into the car and drove to the city limits, where there is a settlement with elite houses. The car stopped at a tall gate. The driver opened the door and escorted Betty to the front door. As she walked leisurely through the courtyard of the house, she had time to see a lot of things. Everything here was tastefully done. It seems that this luxurious house was not built a year ago or 5 years ago, but a little earlier. This architectural style and exterior decoration were very topical at one time. Only a small number of people could afford such houses. Now they're building a little differently. Right at the entrance, Betty was met by the same woman who was freaking out on the street back then. "Hello, our guardian angel. It's so good to see you again. My name is Cecilia. My husband, Kevin. At last we can meet you." The woman smiled a radiant smile. "Nice to meet you. I'm Betty." The lady of the house took Betty by the elbow and led her to a far room. The house was somewhat cool and dark. Cecilia lit the candles on the table and everything changed. The table was set modestly but tastefully. Cecilia kept fiddling in the kitchen and kept bringing more and more dishes to the table. "Where's the girl?" "I don't even know her name," Betty asked. "I have a little present for her." Betty put a beautiful box with a doll on the table. "Our fidgety girl's name is Amalia. She is our only granddaughter. She is now at home with her mother. We took her with us that day to take her to the park and rides. It's our favorite thing to do, as any grandparents do. But the unimaginable happened to us, however. You were the main witness," said Cecilia Fedotovna, putting different salads on Betty's plate. "Then we were told by the doctors that time really did go on for a second. The fact that you were in that place and did not remain indifferent to our grief and saved our girl. Our gratitude to you is immense," Kevin said. "Do you, such a wonderful woman, have children, grandchildren?" Cecilia asked. "Yes, I do. My son John and his wife Julia. Julia has become like a daughter to me. They have 2 children, Eva and Mickey. Unfortunately, they're away from us now. We miss them very much," Betty said. "I suppose you sent them away on vacation or to study?" Cecilia asked. "Ah, if only they had. Almost a year ago, trouble came to our family. My son John had been seriously injured at work, and the accident had caused a lot of other trouble. Because of this, we sent the children to our Julia's parents. There they get more care and they are more at ease. But my kids are going to take them back to their house soon." "What happened to your son?" Kevin asked. Since people were asking, Betty decided to tell the whole story about John's injury, their family battles with the construction company, and their consequences. What an injustice! Cecilia was outraged. You know, Kevin had been in the construction business all his life too. He has always taken safety on his sites very seriously. What's going on now? People underestimate the consequences of their irresponsibility. It's very sad what happened to you. I wish you strength and strong spirit to endure this difficult situation to the end. Cecilia expressed sincere sympathy and compassion. What kind of company is it that ignores all the laws and is so brazenly lawless? Kevin asked. It's called Grand House. Their office is near the Central Park. It's run by a young woman named Emma. Grand House? Kevin rose from his seat. His expression changed. Cecilia put her fork down on the table and looked back and forth at Betty and her husband. Kevin started looking around. His spouse seemed to immediately realize what he was looking for. She pulled his cell phone from the lumber shelf and held it out to him. Kevin took the cell phone and took quick steps up to the second floor of his house. There was an awkward pause at the table. Betty couldn't understand what she had said and why her new acquaintances were reacting so strongly to it. Betty, you and I are sitting here like strangers. Let's drink wine to our loved ones. This great wine is straight from the plantations of France. I'll be sure to give you a bottle or two. You'll love it. Cecilia became even more obliging. After a while, Cecilia apologized and decided to see how her husband was doing. She followed him up to the second floor and disappeared for quite some time. Biggie began to get bored. She looked at her watch and was about to leave. But immediately the couple returned to the table. Kevin remained preoccupied and frustrated. Betty, I promise you that we will meet many more times from now on. And importantly, your case will be resolved. Honestly, I'm very puzzled by your case, he said. What do you mean? Betty asked. Emma, the director of the construction company, will be here any minute. She has something to tell you, said Kevin. It seemed that Betty was beginning to have a vague idea, but she didn't ask any further questions. They began their meal and chatted amiably about various things. A few minutes later, Emma came in. She didn't say hello loudly, nor did she make eye contact with Betty. She went straight to her father and placed a stack of papers on the table in front of him. Well, have a seat, Emma. We're listening to you very carefully, said Kevin. Betty, I'd apologize to you. When my father handed over the company to me, many of his employees objected to it. They didn't want to do business with me. So they resisted me in every way possible and played tricks on me. In particular, the head of HR hated me. She made such a mess of the documents that some of the contracts were actually lost. The new manager assured me that the lost documents had been recovered, but I just found out yesterday that he was lying to me too. I found out that your son Walker John is indeed officially employed by our company. We've reinstated the contract. I've instructed the CFO to release the compensation funds today. Emma said. Why would you want to poison me? Especially when you used a young man who works as a courier to do it. He ended up in the hands of the police. What happened to his fate? Is his mother also crying somewhere and can't get justice? Betty asked. Emma stood by the table like a delinquent schoolboy, afraid of her father's anger. Kevin's anger was only growing. No, there's nothing wrong with the courier. Our lawyer got him out right away. My staff came up with the poisoning idea and all the other details too. I realize now that these people were the ones who were dragging me down the precipice. I wanted to get rid of them from the beginning and form my own team. These people had worked with my father and wanted to continue working with him. All I wanted to do was keep my father's team and keep them in the company. Emma seemed genuinely remorseful. Come on, daughter. You and I will discuss management separately. You can go now, he even said, trying to pull himself together. Emma apologized and quickly left. Only now Betty realized that Director Emma was the daughter of these kindest people. That little girl Amalia, who was saved by Beatty, is the daughter of the very same Emma. This was all confirmed by Cecilia Fedotovna herself. She added, Emma is our only daughter. She received a good education abroad. Her father handed over the company to her only a year ago. He had no other choice. His health was failing him. We realized that the daughter was too young to run such a large company, but her father trusted his deputies. Now our daughter is going through a difficult time. She had a difficult divorce from our granddaughter's father. All these problems that she's had to deal with have become your problems. We're gonna do everything we can to get through this situation unscathed. Cecilia held Betty's hand. Betty had no doubts about the sincerity of those words. Julia couldn't get over the fact that Jonah wasn't answering his phone. She left work early and raced home, but the apartment was empty. She didn't find her husband's personal belongings in the apartment and still couldn't reach him. Where could he have gone? Maybe with Nikita went somewhere on business, or gone to the store or pharmacy? She remembered that she had planned to do laundry in the morning. She went to the closet, opened it, and was surprised. There were no clothes in it, including her husband's. Julia couldn't think of anything. She poured herself some tea and sat down in the kitchen. After a while, the doorbell rang. "Julia, I'm going to tell you something, but don't fall down, dear." Betty put her arm around her and led her into the kitchen. The mother-in-law was all glowing and happy. "I went to visit that family yesterday. I told you about the little girl. Turns out these people are Emma's parents. Can you believe it? They asked me first about my life and my kids. I told them all the details of my history with John. Then Kevin started acting really weird. Eventually, Emma showed up at their house in the morning and apologized to me. And just before lunchtime, John got a call from the company saying that they had reimbursed him for all his medical expenses. This is a dream. Are you kidding me? This is fantastic." Julia was in deep shock. "So you accidentally saved a stranger's girl on the street, then these people decided to thank you, and it turned out that they were the parents of Emma, who is the source of all our misfortunes." Julia couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Yes, that's right. I'm still reeling from the shock. I prayed sincerely in church that day, asking God to help me. He must have heard me. How else can you explain it? I have no other explanation. And the fact that Emma's parents were such honorable people." Betty continued to rejoice. "And that's not all." She added after a while, "I'm not sure whether to tell you now or wait for John to tell you. He wanted to surprise you, and I'm going to spoil it." "Well, Betty, it's not fair. Let's tell you what the surprise is. I'll pretend I don't know yet." Julia began to pry her mother-in-law like a little capricious girl. "All right, I feel like I can't stand it if I don't tell you," said the mother-in-law. "So, the money will be in your account tomorrow. And just the other day, Emma called me this afternoon and told me that they're giving you an apartment in one of the completed houses. Can you imagine? She says she genuinely wants to earn our forgiveness, but I suppose her father told her to do that," Betty said. "Oh my God, are we going to have our own apartment after all?" Julia almost shouted at the top of her voice. "John wanted to surprise you, and I gave it all up to you. He went to see the apartment this afternoon, and it's ready to go. He said you're gonna love it. He's even moved your stuff in." It was only then that Julia noticed that not only John's things were missing from the apartment, but her personal belongings as well. "And I haven't been able to reach him all day, so he was busy with these things?" Julia asked. "Yes, he's busy with them now. Oh, he told me not to tell you yet, just to surprise you. Forgive me, Lord, I can't keep it to myself any longer. He's gone to get the kids now. He'll have them back by morning. You go ahead and get ready. I have the keys to the new apartment. We'll go now. I'll show you around," said Betty and pulled her sister-in-law by the sleeve. They took a cab to the new apartment. Indeed, it was even more spacious than their current apartment, which was about to be foreclosed on by the bank. "I'll pay off the loan with the compensation. If there's some left over, we can buy furniture and appliances at once." Julia lay on the bare floor of the new apartment and dreamed aloud. "Imagine, Betty, no one has ever lived in this apartment before. We'll be the first owners. Oh, out the way, I have a big personal favor to ask of you, Betty. Only you have to agree to it first, and then I'll tell you," Julia said coquettishly. "Oh, what kind of a request is that? You're scaring me, Julia." "Well, consider, I agree to all your proposals," said now melted mother-in-law and a smile. "In this beautiful new apartment we are missing one person, you Betty, my children's favorite grandmother. As you can see, there is plenty of room for everyone. I'm making you an official offer on behalf of our family. John will back me up with both hands. Since you've already accepted, we'll just have to move your things tomorrow. John and the children will be here by then," Julia said and clasped her mother-in-law in her arms. And indeed, John was able to bring the children by lunchtime the next day. Billy had helped him with that. They received their compensation the same day. The money was exactly the amount of the loan taken out for the operation. Julia closed the second loan the same day. A couple weeks later, she got a call from the bank that had issued the mortgage. It turned out that in the days when the Walker family was moving into a new apartment, the bank had already taken the case to court. The court decided to open bidding. The apartment had already been sold, its value covered the family's debt, and there was still some money left in their account. Julia estimated the amount of money and now puzzled. With this money they could buy furniture or go on a trip. Yes, it's not an easy choice. but it was much more pleasant than other choices she had had to make in her recent past.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.